Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Thursday. Yom Hamishi, or now it's Yom Shishi since it's Thursday night. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Thursday? And for our friends who celebrate Christmas, a very Merry Christmas to you. Bill in mid-Missouri, Yehuda in South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Joe in the Inland Empire, Shandora in the Bronx, Guy in Ohio, Belle in Texas, Sharon in New Jersey, Karen in Northern California, Belle saying, Nina, I hope you're on the road to recovery. There's a very nasty flu or something going around. Please God, she should have a complete and speedy recovery. She's still a bit under the weather, but we're taking care of her, and hopefully she'll be back soon as possible. And Sharon says, just got home from shul, Chinese dinner, get-together, and karaoke event. It's been said that a Jewish Christmas is Chinese food and a movie. Been said many times. On the YouTube side, Nancy in North Carolina, Moishi in Brooklyn, Chaim in Florida, Elise in Virginia, Lester in Florida, Alan in New York City, Ilanit in Silver Spring, and John in Arizona. Welcome everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Diana Lazar, in loving memory of my husband, Menashe Hessel Ben Meir. May Menashe Hessel Ben Meir have a great aliyah in the world of souls. We all say amen. And Diana, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. And we say amen and thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. If you'd like to donate to our nonprofit, Accidental Talmudist, donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. We appreciate it very much. It enables us to meet all the expenses that it takes to keep our organization running, and there's a lot of them. Thank you so much. Today's date, 12/25. Okay. Our daf today is page 104 here in Tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud. We're picking this up with a new Mishnah, Mishnah number 3, here in chapter 12. And we're about a little more than halfway down, page 103b. About a little more than halfway down, 103b with the Mishnah, Mishnah 3. If any offerings... Second. Fixing myself up. If any offerings of the most sacred order were disqualified prior to their flaying, right? And we learned that all offerings of the most sacred order are flayed before any parts that go up on the altar are burned there. And the hides of offerings of the most sacred order go to the priests, right? So long as the altar has acquired, right? Meaning that if it's a burnt offering or a sin offering, like the parts that go up on the altar, if those have been acquired by the altar, so to speak, then the hide, which is going to be left over from this animal offering, is a gift to the priests. And we learned that they're all flayed, which certainly eases giving the hide to the priests. Now, very interesting, what if the animal is flayed before the blood is presented on the altar, which is really what completes, fulfills the vow, fulfills the obligation, or effects atonement in the case of a sin offering. Now, normally we imagine, the sheep, the goat, the calf was brought into the Holy Temple when it stood in Jerusalem. It hasn't for 2,000 years, tragically. But when it did, these animals were brought there. Somebody slaughtered them in the courtyard of the Holy Temple. There was a priest right there who would collect the blood, convey it to the altar, and then depending on which kind of offering it was, sprinkle it in the correct place on the altar. Right? Now that the blood has been sprinkled, the main part has been effected. The animal has been sacrificed. Right, with the exception of the Pesach, where the owners eat the animals, and that's an inherent part of the mitzvah. Generally speaking, if you're bringing a sin offering because you need to atone, so you've atoned when that blood hits the altar. Nevertheless, the edible portions of the sin offering go to the priests and they eat that. The parts that are burned on the altar go to the altar and they are burned. But if we're just imagining the priest collecting the blood, conveying it to the altar and sprinkling it, like that's happening probably pretty quickly after the shechting, after the slaughter of the animal. But what they're going to ask today is, what if something went wrong? What if there was an interruption in the procedure? Normally, right, the blood is the first thing that happens. He's slaughtered, collected, conveyed to the altar, and sprinkled. Then if the animal is going to be, cut up, so the parts are eaten, parts are burned on the altar, and as part of that process, the skin is going to be removed, the flaying, that's all going to happen well after the blood is sprinkled. But what if something goes awry? And after the blood was collected, the blood couldn't be brought to the altar. A priest, maybe put it down for a second, got interrupted, something happened. And the blood was only sprinkled later, right? Later. And in the meantime, the animal was flayed. So now, if we're going to say, if the blood is sprinkled on the altar properly, then the sacrifice has basically been done. And eventually, when the animal is flayed, the hide is going to go to the priest. But what if the flaying occurs before the sprinkling? And more importantly, what if the animal somehow becomes disqualified after the flaying and before the sprinkling? Will the priest still receive the hide? Questions like that question and others like it are what we're looking at tonight. So if any offerings of the most sacred order were disqualified prior to their flaying, their hides do not go to the priests. Rather, they are burned together with the flesh in the place of burning. Now we're talking about the animal was simply disqualified. If it was disqualified before it was slaughtered, it shouldn't have been slaughtered, but maybe they didn't find out about it afterwards. But if it's disqualified, certainly before the blood is sprinkled, the animal was shechted, and then somehow was disqualified before the blood was sprinkled, like, for example, if the one slaughtering it had in mind to eat of it beyond the deadline the next day or the day after, so pigul, that would disqualify it at the time of shechting. In that case, we shouldn't be sprinkling the blood, and that animal is not going to be eaten by the priest, and its hide will not go to the priest. Rather, it's going to go to the place of burning. And as we'll learn tonight, there are 3 places of burning depending on the offering, the kind of disqualification, etc. Okay. So if any offerings of the most sacred order were disqualified prior to their flaying, Their hides do not go to the priest, rather they are burned together with the flesh in the place of burning. If they were disqualified after the flaying, their hides go to the priests, right? Because things have been done correctly up until then. If something went wrong, for example, the animal was flayed properly, its blood was sprinkled properly, and now before the meat is eaten by the priests, it gets disqualified. Okay, but at the time of the flaying, everything had been done right until then, so the priests that were supposed to get those hides acquired them. Rabbi Hanina, the deputy high priest, said, "In all my days, I never saw a hide going out to the place of burning." Rabbi Akiva said, from the statement of Rabbi Hanina, the deputy high priest, we learned that in a case where one flays the firstborn offering, the bechor, and the animal is later discovered to have a wound that would have caused it to die within 12 months, right? It was a treifa. That's the kind of blemish on an animal that you don't find out about until you've slaughtered it. But had you known about it before, it would have been disqualified. You wouldn't have slaughtered that animal. It's considered like a walking dead. Let's say it really again. Rabbi Akiva said, from the statement of Rabbi Hanina, the deputy high priest, we learned that in the case of one who flays the bechor and the treifa, the law is that the priest may derive benefit from its hide. Even though it was later be learned that it's a treifa, at the time of the flaying, you didn't know that. And so the priest may derive benefit. They may take the hide. And the rabbis say, disagreeing, the rabbis say, well, the claim we did not see, right? When Rabbi Hanina, right, that was his name? Rabbi Hanina, the deputy high priest, said, in all my days, I never saw one of these hides go out to the place of burning, right? It must be that no animal was ever disqualified at that stage where it was shechted, its blood was sprinkled, and it was flayed, and only later they found out it was disqualified. So no hide was ever, if the animal was flayed, its hide ended up going to the priest and didn't go to the place of burning, says Rabbi Hanina. And Rabbi Akiva says, from that we learn that in the case of a treifa or a bechor, that was found to be disqualified, the priest nevertheless acquired the hides. But the majority overrule Rabbi Akiva's conclusion, and they say the statement we did not see is no proof. The fact that it never happened doesn't mean that that's the law. Right? That's what the rabbis are saying as they overrule Rabbi Akiva. So rather, if after flaying it is discovered that the animal was unfit before it was flayed, the hide does go out to the place of burning. Maybe it didn't happen when Rabbi Hanina was looking. Maybe it never happened because against all odds it never happened. But that is what should have happened if an animal was disqualified, was found to be disqualified after it was flayed. That's the Mishna. Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 12. Now the Gemara. The previous Mishnah, Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 12, taught in the case of any burnt offering for which the altar did not acquire its flesh, for example, if it was disqualified prior to the sprinkling of the blood, the priest did not acquire the hide. If they didn't get the flesh to eat of a sin offering, they also don't get the hide. Now, the Mishnah does not state any qualification, indicating that this is the law even if the priest flayed the hide before the sprinkling of the blood on the altar. Again, that would be an unusual occurrence since it's so easy to collect the blood and sprinkle it on the altar. That's a quick thing. Flaying the animal, would seem apparently take longer. But it could happen. Maybe they were, butchering quickly. There was a very expert guy in flaying. And there was a line of priests waiting to sprinkle at the altar. So it could happen that the flaying precedes the sprinkling. So what if it was disqualified after the flaying, but before the sprinkling? Do the priests still keep the hide? So the Gemara posits, whose opinion is this? It is the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, who says the blood does not affect acceptance on the hide by itself, i.e. it affects acceptance of the hide only together with the flesh. Since the flesh is disqualified because it happened before the sprinkling, and the sprinkling does not affect its acceptance, the sprinkling also does not affect acceptance of the hide. Right? So according to this view, if the flesh can't be eaten by the priest, the hide can't be kept by the priest. Now the Gemara challenges this and says, say that the latter clause, i.e. the Mishnah here, if any offerings of the most sacred order were disqualified prior to their flaying, their hides do not go to the priests. So if they were disqualified after their flaying, even if it was before the sprinkling, the hides do go to the priests. Right? This indicates that once the hides are flayed, they go to the priest, even if the flesh was disqualified before the sprinkling of the blood. So if so, we arrive at the opinion of Rebbe, who says the blood affects acceptance of the hide, i.e. it renders the hide permitted to the priests by itself, right? Even if the flesh was disqualified because it became tameh or something after the flaying but before the sprinkling, if the animal was already flayed before the disqualification happened, then at the time of the sprinkling will affect acceptance such that the hide can be kept by the priest. It's interesting because if the animal was disqualified before the sprinkling, maybe there shouldn't have been sprinkling, but maybe they didn't know that the disqualification happened after the flaying and before the sprinkling, but they didn't find out until after the sprinkling. Now, can it be that the former clause of the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, and the latter clause is in accordance with the opinion of Rebbe? Abaye said, since the latter clause is the opinion of Rebbe, it must be that the former clause is also the opinion of Rebbe. And although Rebbe holds that in principle the priests should acquire the hides if they are removed before the flesh is disqualified, in any case, right, at the time that the skin was flayed, the hide was removed, the animal was still a qualified offering, and the hide was separated from it. If later, let's say the flesh of that animal became tameh, came into contact with the shara, it's a dead creeping thing. Okay, well, the hide didn't come into contact with that. When the hide was separated, it was still a qualified offering. Abaye said, since the latter clause is the opinion of Rebbe, it must be that the former clause is also the opinion of Rebbe. And although Rebbe holds that in principle the priest should acquire the hides if they are removed before the flesh is disqualified, in any case, Rebbe concedes that the flaying is not done before the sprinkling. Since the offering cannot be disqualified before the hide is removed, practically speaking, the priest will never acquire the hides unless the altar acquires the flesh, as taught in the former clause. Right? They're saying that practically speaking, it doesn't happen that the animal gets flayed before the blood is conveyed to the altar and sprinkled there. Rava said, on the contrary, since the former clause is the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, it must be that the latter clause is also the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon. So when the Mishnah states that the priests acquire the hides if the flesh was disqualified after the flaying, it must mean that the flesh was disqualified after the sprinkling. Therefore, what does the Mishnah mean by the phrase before flaying? And what does it mean by the phrase after flaying? It means before the moment the offerings became fit for flaying, and after the moment that they became fit for flaying, i.e. before and after the sprinkling of the blood. Right? Once the blood is sprinkled, atonement has been effected or the obligation has been fulfilled, then, right, the flesh has been acquired for eating by the priest. And before they can actually do that, the flaying has to happen. But the animal is now fit for flaying because its blood has already been sprinkled, right? You could avoid that problem ever happening by making it a rule in the temple. It must be sprinkled. The blood must be sprinkled before the animal is flayed or the flesh is separated to the edible portions and what is going to be burned on the altar. Okay, now we're on page 104a. So the Gemara clarifies, what is the opinion of Rebbe and what is the opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon? So their opinions are as it is taught in a baraisa. Rebbe says, the blood effects acceptance of the hide by itself after it has been flayed, even if the flesh is disqualified. And if when the hide is still with the flesh, a disqualification appears on the flesh, whether before the sprinkling of the blood or after the sprinkling of the blood, then the law with regard to the hide is parallel to the law with regard to the flesh. Both are burned, right? If the animal was disqualified it's going to have to be burned. And in this case, the hide goes with it because the hide is still attached to the flesh of the animal. Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon says, the blood does not effect acceptance of the hide by itself. And if, when the hide is still with the flesh, a disqualification appears on the flesh before the sprinkling of the blood, right? Now this animal's disqualified. We're not going to sprinkle the blood. It's going to have to be taken out to the place of burning. It will not go to the altar. And the hide won't go either, right? And the hide won't go to the priests either. And if, when the hide is still with the flesh, a disqualification appears on the flesh before the sprinkling of the blood, then the law with regard to the hide is the same as the law with regard to the flesh. Both are burned. If a disqualification develops on the flesh after the sprinkling of the blood, the flesh was already accepted for a time. Therefore, even though the flesh will be disqualified now because it came into contact with some tuma, and therefore the priest can't eat it, it had a period of fitness after the blood was sprinkled and before it became disqualified, and therefore the priest may flay the animal before it is burned, and its hide goes to the priest. Right? Interesting. Even though the hide is with the flesh at the time of its disqualification in the flesh, which is after the sprinkling, since it had a period of fitness before they discovered this disqualification, even at this stage, they may flay the animal and keep the hide, and only the flesh will go out to the place of burning, which is not the altar. Right? This is the place of burning of disqualified offerings. The Gemara suggests, shall we say that Rebbe and Rabbi Elazar disagree about the same principle as do Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua? What do they disagree about? As it is taught in Baraisa, the verse states, and you shall offer your burnt offerings, the flesh and the blood, upon the altar of the Lord your God, Deuteronomy 12:27. Rabbi Yehoshua says, the verse teaches that if there is no blood sprinkled on the altar, no flesh may be burned on the altar. And if there's no flesh to be burned on the altar, no blood may be sprinkled on the altar. Right? So this is not only the idea that if it becomes disqualified, then you don't, before the sprinkling, then you don't sprinkle. Here we're talking about there needs to be flesh. Right? What happens if the animal is slaughtered? And the blood is collected, and before the priest conveying the blood to the altar can sprinkle it there, an accident happens, a fire breaks out in the holy temple. A bear runs into the holy temple, snatches that animal offering and runs off with it. Right? So it's gone, literally, physically gone. There is no meat of the offering there anymore. Then can they sprinkle the blood to complete the atonement process of the owner of the sin offering? No. Some of that meat must still remain, and it can be a very small amount, a tiny amount, I think a ketzayas, an olive bulb. But if that minimum amount does not remain of the flesh of the offering, then the blood, even though the blood was collected and held separately, it cannot be sprinkled on the altar. That flesh must still be around at the time of sprinkling. Rabbi Eliezer says the blood must be sprinkled even if there is no flesh. Right? He disagrees with this. As it is stated in the continuation of the verse, and the blood of your sacrifices shall be poured out against the altar of the Lord your God, and you shall eat the flesh. If so, what is taught when the verse states, and you shall offer your burnt offerings, the flesh and the blood? It is stated to tell you, just as blood is placed on the altar by sprinkling, so too the flesh is placed on the altar by tossing. Consequently, you learn that there is a space between the ramp and the altar such that the priest must toss the flesh from the edge of the ramp. And the Gemara explains, shall we say that the one who says that the hide is accepted independent of the flesh holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, that the blood is sprinkled independent of the flesh, and the one who says that the hide is not accepted independent of the flesh holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua, that if there is no flesh, then the blood is not sprinkled. But the Gemara rejects this analysis. No, you're understanding it wrong. According to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who holds that the blood may be sprinkled even if the flesh is disqualified, everyone agrees that this sprinkling affects acceptance of the hide. When they disagree, it is according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua. The one who says that the hide is not accepted independently of the flesh, i.e. Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon, holds in accordance with the straightforward meaning of the statement of Rabbi Yehoshua, Once the flesh is disqualified, the blood cannot be sprinkled, and therefore it does not affect acceptance for the owner, nor acceptance of the hide for the priest. The one who says that the hide is accepted, i.e. Rebbe, could say to you, Rabbi Yehoshua says only there that the blood may not be sprinkled in a case where nothing but the flesh was at stake, where there is no loss for the priest, who never received meat from burnt offerings. But in cases where the hide would go to waste, where there is a loss for the priests, perhaps even Rabbi Yehoshua concedes that the blood does affect acceptance, at least as far as the hide is concerned. The latter interpretation of Rabbi Yehoshua's opinion with regard to the hides is just as it is with regard to the disqualified flesh after the fact. As we learned in a bira, if the flesh contracted tuma, or it was disqualified, or if it emerged beyond the curtains delineating its designated area, meaning it left the temple courtyard, Rabbi Eliezer says the priest must nevertheless sprinkle the blood on the altar. Rabbi Yehoshua says no, the priest may not sprinkle the blood on the altar. And Rabbi Yehoshua concedes that if the priest nevertheless sprinkled the blood, the offering is accepted after the fact. So apparently the sprinkling is sufficiently valid to effect acceptance of the hide, even though before the fact we would never sprinkle the blood if the flesh was lost, etc., if it became disqualified. Now, the Mishna teaches that Rabbi Hanina, the deputy high priest, said, in all my days I never saw a hide going out to the place of burning. So the Gemara challenges that and says, and is it so that he did not see? Aren't there bulls that are burned and goats that are burned together with their hides as a matter of course, right? These are the inner sin offerings, the ones that are brought inside the sanctuary, and their blood is sprinkled on the curtain between the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies, and on the incense altar, the golden altar, the little altar inside the sanctuary. Those are offerings for the Yom Kippur bull and goat. The bull of the Sanhedrin that made an error with respect to Jewish law, and the people followed it, so they all sinned because they relied on an erroneous ruling of the Sanhedrin. They bring a bull. The bull of an anointed high priest who makes a mistake, and the goat when the Sanhedrin makes an erroneous ruling and the people rely on it and commit idolatry. Those 5 offerings, the inner sin offerings, after their blood is sprinkled on the inner curtain and the incense altar, etc., those animals are not brought to the external altar. We've learned this a bunch of times. Rather, they are burned somewhere else. Now we're going to talk about where they are burned, right? Those animals are burned not on the outer altar, not in the temple courtyard, not on the Temple Mount, and not in Jerusalem. Very interesting, right? Those animals that are burned have to go completely outside of Jerusalem. Disqualified offerings, which cannot be burned on the altar because they are disqualified, so they need to be burned, they are burned in the temple courtyard, right? So disqualified offerings, there's a place of burning for them in the temple courtyard, and there's one other place of burning, which is in Jerusalem on the Temple opposite the Temple Mount. I think opposite the Temple Mount. And that is for offerings that don't leave Jerusalem, like inner offerings. They should have been burned in the temple courtyard, but they left the temple courtyard, so there's a special place of burning for them, as we shall see. Okay. Where was I? So the Gemara challenges, but isn't there the case where an offering is and the Gemara challenges Rabbi Hanina, who said he never saw hides burnt in the place of burning. And the Gemara challenged that by saying, is it so that he did not see? Aren't there the bulls that are burned and the goats that are burned together with their hides as a matter of course? And the Gemara answers, we are not saying that Rabbi Hanina never saw hides go out to be burned in accordance with their mitzvah, right? They're supposed to be burned. When we're talking about those inner sin offerings, he certainly did, but rather he never saw hides being burned because the offering was disqualified and now the hides were burned by themselves even after flaying. The Gemara challenges, but isn't there a case where an offering is disqualified before flaying and before the sprinkling of the blood, in which case all agree that the animal is burned with its hide? And the Gemara answers, we are saying that Rabbi Hanina never saw a hide go out stripped of its flesh. The Gemara challenges this and says, but isn't there a case where an offering is disqualified after the flaying of the hide and before the sprinkling of the blood, in which case the hide should be burned according to the opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon, who says the blood does not affect acceptance of the hide by itself. So according to that opinion, the hide should go out and be burned. And the Gemara answers, well, Rabbi Hanina holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi, not the opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi holds that the blood does affect acceptance of the hide in such a case, and so it would not be burned. And if you wish, say instead that you can even interpret the opinion of Rabbi Hanina in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon, as Rabbi concedes that the flaying is not done before the sprinkling, and so in practice Rabbi Hanina never saw a hide that was flayed before the offering was disqualified. But the Gemara challenges it again and says, but isn't there the case of an animal that, after the hide was flayed and the blood was sprinkled, then it was found in its intestines to be a treifa and therefore disqualified? And what are we going to do about that point? Right, at that point, the meat's not going to be eaten, even though the blood was already sprinkled, but the hide has already been removed. Are we going to burn the hide, or are we going to let the priest keep it? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Hanina holds that in the case of an animal that was found to be a treifa due to a wound in its intestines, the sprinkling of the blood nevertheless does affect acceptance because the wound was unknown at the time of the sprinkling. And the language of the Mishna is also precise, as it teaches. Rabbi Akiva said, from the statement of Rabbi Hanina, the deputy high priest, we learn that in a case where one flays the bechor and the animal is later discovered to be a treifa, the law is that the priest may derive benefit from its hide. And this indicates that the sprinkling of the blood affects acceptance if the wound was unknown at the time of the sprinkling. And the Gemara affirms, indeed, learn from the Mishnah that this is so. But the Gemara challenges one more time and says, but if this is what Rabbi Hanina meant, then what is Rabbi Akiva teaching us? His statement seems unnecessary. And the Gemara answers, this is what Rabbi Akiva is teaching us. The halacha applies, the law applies, not just in the temple, but even in the outlying areas. For example, with regard to a blemished bechor, a firstborn, which is slaughtered outside the temple, if it is discovered to be a treifa before its slaughter, it must be buried with its hide. But if it is slaughtered and later discovered to be a treifa, then its slaughter renders the hide permitted to the priest, just as the sprinkling of the blood renders the hide permitted to the temple. Rabbi Chia bar Abba says that Rabbi Yochanan says the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara adds, and even Rabbi Akiva said this law only in a case where an expert verified the bechor's blemish and permitted it to be slaughtered. But if an expert did not permit it, then its slaughter does not render the hide permitted to the priest. And the Gemara concludes, and the law is in accordance with the statement of the rabbis, not Rabbi Akiva. Therefore, the flesh is discarded by burial and the hide by burning. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah 3 here in chapter 12. We move on to Mishnah 4. With regard to the bulls that are burned, i.e. the bull of Yom Kippur, the bull of the anointed priest, and the bull brought for an unwitting communal sin, which are burned after their blood is sprinkled and their sacrificial portions burned on the altar, and goats that are burned, i.e. the goat of Yom Kippur and the goat brought for an unwitting communal transgression of the prohibition against idolatry, when they are burned in accordance with their mitzvah, they are burned in the place of ashes. It's called the place of ashes according to Leviticus 4:12. And this is outside of Jerusalem. And they render the garments of the priests who tend to their burning tameh. And if these offerings are not burned in accordance with their mitzvah because they were disqualified, and offerings that are disqualified are also burned, they are burned in the place of burning in the bira, which is inside the temple courtyard where they burn disqualified offerings, as opposed to these special inner sin offerings, which when they are burned, they're burned outside of Jerusalem entirely. But regular disqualified offerings are burned in the bira, and the offerings that are burned there, disqualified offerings that are burned there, do not render the garments of the priest tending to them tameh. right? Like the carcass of an animal renders a person tameh and his garments tameh. But if it was an offering that was properly disposed of, even a disqualified offering, it doesn't render the garments tameh. Now we continue Mishnah 4 on page 104b. And now the priest would carry the bulls and the goats that are burned suspended on poles. And when the first priest carrying the front of the pole emerged outside the wall of the temple courtyard, and the latter priest did not yet emerge, then the first priest rendered their garments impure, and the latter priests do not render their garments impure until they emerge. Right? These offerings that are being sent outside of the temple, because they're still in accordance with their mitzvah, they don't render the garments tameh until the priest leaves the temple, and then they do render the garments tameh. When both these and those priests have emerged, they render their garments tameh. Rabbi Shimon says they do not render the garments tameh, as this law applies only to those who burn the offerings, not just the ones who carried on a pole. And even then, their garments do not become tameh until the fire is ignited in the majority of their offerings. Once the flesh is completely scorched with no moisture remaining, one who then burns the remains does not render his garments tameh, because that's no longer an animal or an animal carcass. Once it's that much burned, it's just remains that don't impart tuma anymore. And that's the end of Mishnah number 4. Now the Gemara. The Mishnah teaches that if offerings of a type that are burned were disqualified, they are burned in a place of burning called the bira. Right? This is regular offerings that are burned, let's say a burnt offering, and it became disqualified, so it can't be burned on the mizbeach, on the altar. Where is it burned? In another spot in the temple courtyard known as the bira, the place of burning disqualified offerings. The Gemara says, what is the bira? Rabbi Hanina says that Rabbi Yochanan says there is a place on the Temple Mount, and its name is bira, and this is where they would burn these offerings. And Reish Lakish says, no, that's not what bira means. The entire temple is called the bira, as it is stated in the prayer of David, quote, and give unto Solomon my son a whole heart to keep your commandments, your testimonies, and your statutes, and to do all this and to build the temple, and here called bira, for which I have made provision. So it seems that we know from the context that David is praying to God that he will enable his son Solomon to build the temple. And in that verse, the temple is referred to as the bira. So what they're saying is, if it's burned in the bira, it has to be burned within the precincts of the holy temple. Rav Nachman says that Rabbi Bar Abu says there are 3 places of the ashes. First was the great place of the ashes that was in the temple courtyard, where the priests would burn the disqualified offerings of the most sacred order and the disqualified sacrificial portions of offerings of lesser sanctity and bulls that are burned and goats that are burned if they were disqualified prior to the sprinkling of the blood. Right? So if they don't, if it's an inner sin offering, but it became disqualified prior to the sprinkling of the blood, then it can be burned in the bira. It doesn't have to go out to the special place of burning for those inner offerings, which is outside of Jerusalem entirely. And there was another place of the ashes on the Temple Mount where the priests would burn bulls that are burned and goats that are burned if they are disqualified after the sprinkling of the blood. And the third place of the ashes was for the bulls and the goats that were burned in accordance with their mitzvah outside the 3 camps, i.e. outside the walls of Jerusalem. Why do we say outside the 3 camps? Because that is referring to the encampment of the children of Israel in the wilderness, right? 40 years of wandering after leaving Egypt. It was called 3 camps. Why would you call it 3 camps? Weren't there 12 tribes? Yes, 3 camps, concentric circles, right? The 12 tribes were arranged in an array, kind of squared off, almost like the cross in the center of a Swiss flag, right? So 3 tribes north, 3 tribes east, 3 tribes west, south, 3 tribes west. Then in the middle, right? So that's the first camp. Then inside of that, in the middle, is the camp of the Levites. That's the second camp. And then inside that, right, entirely surrounded by the camp of the Levites, is the actual, the Mishkan, right, the tabernacle, which later corresponded to the temple itself. So that's why they're called 3 camps, and those correspond to increasing holiness, right? Outside the encampment entirely, That would be like outside of Jerusalem, within the encampment of the 12 tribes, but outside the camp of the Levites. That's Jerusalem. That's equivalent to Jerusalem, analogous to Jerusalem, or Jerusalem is analogous to it. Then the camp of the Levites and the Temple Mount is analogous to that. Temple Mount, the entire Temple Mount. And then the Mishkan, right? That the analogous to that, of course, is the Holy Temple itself. Okay, where am I? Yeah. So Levi teaches a different version of this baraisa. There are 3 places of the ashes. First was the great place of the ashes that was in the temple courtyard, where the priest would burn the disqualified offerings of the most sacred order, and the disqualified sacrificial portions of offerings of lesser sanctity, and bulls that are burned, and goats that are burned, if they were disqualified, whether prior to the sprinkling of the blood or after the sprinkling of the blood. And there was another place of the ashes on the Temple Mount, but outside the temple, where the priest would burn bulls that are burned and goats that are burned if they were disqualified upon emerging from the temple courtyard. And the third was for bulls and goats burned in accordance with their mitzvah outside the 3 camps and therefore entirely outside of Jerusalem. Rabbi Yirmiyah raised a dilemma. The flesh of most offerings is disqualified by being left overnight. What is the law as to whether being left overnight is effective to disqualify bulls that are burned and goats that are burned? Given that their flesh is never eaten nor burned on the altar, do we say when being left overnight is effective to disqualify flesh, this is only in a case of flesh that is fit for consumption, either by the altar or by human beings? But in the case of these bulls and goats of the inner sin offerings, which are burned outside of Jerusalem, they are not fit for consumption, so perhaps being left overnight does not disqualify them. Or perhaps this case is no different and being left overnight disqualifies those offerings like any other sin offerings. Rava said this matter, Rabbi Yirmiyah's dilemma, was raised by Abaye, and I resolved it from this baraisa. The Mishna in this tractate on page 43a records a dispute as to whether the sacrificial portions of bulls that are burned are subject to disqualification by intent to burn them beyond their designated time, pigul. But the disputants agree that if the priest intended for the consumption of the bull's meat and their burning to be beyond their designated time, he did nothing, as pigul applies only to flesh that is consumed by human beings or the altar. And what, is it not the case that since the intention of burning after the designated time does not disqualify bulls that are burned, one can infer that being left overnight also does not disqualify bulls that are burned? And the Gemara responds, well, but perhaps it is only improper intention that does not disqualify such offerings, but being left overnight does disqualify them. So the Gemara suggests, come in here a Mishnah from Tractate Me'ilah, 9a. With regard to bulls that are burned and goats that are burned, one who benefits from them is liable for Me'ilah, misuse of consecrated property, from the time that they are consecrated. Once they have been slaughtered, they are susceptible to be rendered disqualified for sacrifice through contact with one who immersed that day, a Tevul Yom, and through contact with one who has not yet brought an atonement offering, and through being left overnight without the requirements of offerings having been fulfilled. And what, is it not referring to the flesh of bulls, indicating that the flesh of those bulls, if disqualified, if left overnight, even if they are bulls from the inner sin offerings? I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Yeah. So the Gemara responds, no. The Mishnah indicates only that the offering's sacrificial portions are disqualified if left overnight, since they must be burned on the altar, unlike the bulls of inner sin offerings. The Gemara responds, but evidence to the contrary can be adduced from the fact that the latter clause of the Mishnah teaches, in all those cases, one who benefits from them is liable for Me'ilah if he derives benefit while they are burned in the place of ashes, until the flesh is completely incinerated. So the Gemara explains from the fact that the latter clause is discussing flesh, right, that is eaten or burned on the altar, infer that the first clause also discusses flesh and not the sacrificial portions. So the Gemara rejects this. Are the cases comparable? The latter clause discusses flesh and the first clause discusses sacrificial portions. The Gemara suggests, come in here, that which Levi teaches in the baraisa. There was another place of the ashes on the Temple Mount where the priest would burn the bulls that are burned and the goats that are burned if they were disqualified upon emerging from the temple courtyard. Right? They were emerging from the temple courtyard on their way to the special place of their burning outside of Jerusalem, but they became disqualified. So since they left the temple courtyard, they don't go back in to go to the bira, but they're not going to be burned according to their mitzvah out at the place outside of Jerusalem. That's why you need the special in-between place for only these kinds of offerings, inner offerings that became disqualified when they left the temple courtyard. And what? Is it not referring to offerings disqualified by being left overnight? And the Gemara rejects this. No, it is referring to disqualification by contracting tumah. After they left the temple courtyard, they came into contact with some source of tumah. Or disqualification by leaving the courtyard before the blood was sprinkled on the altar. Therefore, the dilemma of Rabbi Yirmiyah stands unresolved. Rabbi Elazar raises a different dilemma. In general, the flesh of offerings is disqualified by leaving the temple courtyard. What is the law as to whether leaving is effective to disqualify bulls that are burned and goats that are burned? So the Gemara asks, what is the dilemma that he is raising? Here it is a mitzvah to burn the flesh of these offerings outside the temple courtyard. It has to leave the temple courtyard. Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba said, Rabbi Elazar raises his dilemma in accordance with the opinion of the one who says, with regard to offerings of lesser sanctity, even though the flesh may be consumed anywhere in Jerusalem, nevertheless, if it emerges from the temple courtyard before the sprinkling of the blood, it is disqualified because its time to leave the temple courtyard has not yet arrived. And perhaps the same law applies to the bulls and goats that are burned. Even though the flesh must eventually leave the temple, if it leaves before its designated time, it's disqualified. So the dilemma is, do we say that this matter, disqualification by leaving the temple courtyard prematurely, applies only to flesh that need not eventually leave due to an obligation? One may consume the meat of offerings of lesser sanctity in the temple courtyard if he wishes, but perhaps these bulls and goats that are burned, which must eventually leave due to an obligation, are not disqualified by leaving prematurely. Or perhaps here too the flesh is disqualified if its time to leave has not yet arrived. So the Gemara suggests, come in here that which Levi teaches. In the Baraisa, there was another place of the ashes on the Temple Mount where the priests would burn the bulls that are burned and the goats that are burned if they were disqualified upon emerging from the temple courtyard. And what? Is it not referring to disqualification by leaving the temple courtyard before the sprinkling of the blood? No, not necessarily. The Gemara responds, no, it is referring to disqualification by contracting tumah or disqualification by being left overnight. There's three ways that it could become disqualified after it left the temple courtyard and before it reached the special place of burning for those kinds of inner offerings outside of Jerusalem. It could be left overnight, it could be come into contact with tumah, or it could have left the temple prematurely. We don't know which, so we can't decide the answer to this dilemma, and so it is left unresolved. That's what I've got for us today. I'm going to take a couple of comments. Boom. From Sharon. Let's see. Sharon, do we know today where the specific locations of these special alternative locations of burning are? I don't know. Even as we went in passing, right, what did they say? Well, the bira is a place where this is done, meaning a place exists as opposed to it's the whole temple courtyard. But we don't know. I mean, it wasn't spelled out here. So do we know as a matter of, archaeological knowledge? I don't know. Do we know, is there a tradition that's specified somewhere else? Hard to tell. I mean, like the Temple Institute has mapped out, to the best of the kind of like archaeology in conjunction with Talmudic study, where they believe the temple exactly stood on the Temple Mount. It's hard to tell, right? Because it was destroyed by the Romans, and then there was all these, other kingdoms that colonized the Holy Land, right? The Romans colonized the Holy Land. The Arabs colonized the Holy Land. Many empires colonized the Holy Land. And really did a number on the Temple Mount. So we know where the Temple Mount is, and we know, that the wall we call the Western Wall was like an outer retaining wall of the Temple Mount. But do we know where the exact location of where the walls of the Holy Temple were? And within that, maybe if we knew that, we might know where the place of burning was exactly. Like we know where the north of the courtyard was. Like we know a lot of what took place within the temple when it existed. So I just don't know exactly where the temple was on the Temple Mount. As for this place of burning outside of Jerusalem, I don't know if they know that or not. It's a great question. And then Sharon says, I'm having difficulty with the image of tossing the flesh. So we mentioned that in passing. The point being that the ramp has to have, like, it doesn't touch the altar. Somehow there needed to be like a very small gap, but like you could look down and see a gap between the top of the altar and the ramp of the altar. And that satisfied certain halakhic requirements, but I'm not sure that, given how large the altar was, right? We've read it was quite big, right? Like maybe 45 feet across. I mean, this office is like 20 feet. So twice that. The fire's in the middle. That's a long throw, for the sacred meat of an offering. I don't really think that that's what they meant. When they're talking about tossing, it might have meant, that as they stepped over that gap, they kind of like elevated the meat a little bit. Or when they reached the altar, then they did have to toss it because it's a big fire, and at a certain point, like you can place stuff in a fire, but if it's super hot, okay, you get as close as you can, and then it's a small toss. So I'm not sure. I don't think there's real throwing. There are some things that are thrown, and I agree with you. It's hard to imagine them treating these kinds of items with that kind of cavalier attitude. But there's certain needs that the tossing solves, but it's just not the subject of tonight's class. That's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Friday, regular Friday time, noon Pacific. Have a good night.